Hey, I figured I'd do this in a video because it'd be faster, and I don't really have much time today. But one of the things, as was pointed out, is that the kind of the perspective in this one doesn't quite favor the subject matter. And in fact, in a lot of these, I think there are some, in all of these rather, there are some features that I think could enhance the overall tone of the image and make it feel a little bit more dynamic overall. I'm going to start with this one because I think it might be the easiest to describe, but one of the main things is that this ship exists in the space in kind of an odd position. Typically, when you're thinking about composition, a really good thing to do is to break it up into the rule of thirds, which is to cut the image up into lines in each different ways. You probably know this, so forgive me if I sound patronizing. I'm not trying. I'm just trying to be clear. And so basically the idea is that our points of interest are either on these areas here or otherwise in the center of the image. And so that leads us to kind of conclude, based off of how much contrast exists in the image so far, that this is kind of the focal point because A, the ship is moving right there. We've also got another set of lines moving right there, as well as this thing and this thing. Everything's kind of guiding us to that point right there. So one of the things I might consider doing is I might consider moving the ship there. This does a few things. First off, it makes a lot of contrast and a lot of a sharp edge between the brightest part of the image as well as the darker part of the image too. So you have two layers of contrast right there. Not to mention all the leading lines that normally exist in the image are kind of pointing us directly to the subject matter. At least I think that the ship is partially the subject matter, with the cane band being this sort of secondary subject matter. And so if we wanted to expand that further, I would say we could probably scale this guy up in the image even more so. We could even think about, I think one of the nice things about scaling it up too is that we get an opportunity to occlude elements of the cane band in the side. Let me see if I can center this a little bit more overtly. There we go. And that lets us kind of change up some things about the image. I think one of the things I also like to do is maybe kind of add some dynamism to the image as a whole. Change things up to be a little bit more dynamic so that the cane band and the freighter are less on the same sort of plane of existence. I think within the context of space we have a little bit more freedom to mess around with what is the plane of reality. And so in doing this, again, we do a few things. I think one of the more important things is that we're giving some overlap. So this becomes the foreground, this becomes the midground, and this becomes the background back here. And so that gives us a sensation about size, and then we can follow that up. Let me finish the background really quick right here with just blocking out the tones more than anything, or the values, I should say. Then we can follow that up with something even... I'm not really describing myself. Hang on. I gotta finish this or else I can't move forward. All right, so the other thing is the shadow. In the previous variation, the shadow for the ship is kind of falling right there, which is nice, right? Because that kind of gives us an opportunity to say that, oh, this is in fact in front of the cane band. And that was a nice cue, but it wasn't strong enough for it to exist on its own. However, when we have this kind of thing right here cutting through not only the cane band but also the plane of the planet, then the addition of shadow in an area that we might want it really kind of speaks a little bit more towards the general scale and gives us another point of contrast to deal with, which might be really nice. Well, let's say, I mean, logistically, I think if we follow the same kind of path, it'd be somewhere more over here. But this is where we lie to tell the truth, to find the best possible spot. Give ourselves yet another cue to give us direction as to where we want to go. And then adjust the value to match like what you'd see in space, which is, shadows would be pretty damn strong, all things considered. But we also want to make it perhaps a little bit more blue. There we go. A little bit better. And then finally, one thing that I would add, and maybe this is in post more than anything, is a little bit of a gradient to the cane band. Right now, we have this really nice warm to cool that exists on the ship, but we're not necessarily seeing it back there. And then, so what I might do is just generally add some kind of a warm to cool nice big color filter. Oops. Blur. Gaussian blur. That nice and fat and big. Maybe an overlay layer specifically. It only really has to exist for that band. Might dupe it and kind of darken the cane band a little bit if possible. No, not really. One of the things that I noticed within composition is that the eye tends to follow light to dark. So maybe we kind of give the grade where it's darker to the left and brighter to the right. I don't know. I could get lost here. You know, nice thing might be to kind of reference, give a little bit of an edge to the top of the cane band to kind of match what's happening with the top of the Leviathan. Anyway, so that's one. This one is a little bit more of a complicated one for a few different reasons. Essentially, there's only two objects in the scene. So you have, but that doesn't mean we don't have foreground, midground, and background, which we do. We have our foreground right here, our midground there, and our background being space. And it's a very kind of abstract image in the sense because of the fact that it's essentially three shapes interacting with each other. You've got a rectangle, a circle, and then in the midst of a square with maybe a tertiary trapezoid right there. But one of the things that I've learned really matters are what's called tangents. And what a tangent is typically is the intersection of two shapes really close together. It's really I'm not sure if it's mathematical, probably is, and I'm probably making myself a fool by trying to describe it that way. But generally speaking, when two objects come really close together, it can be like a triangle and a square, there's a lot of tension that gets put into this sort of point right here. Whereas if you space them a bit further a point, there's less tension, and you know, even less tension the further far away they are. And so what we're seeing in this one is, well, actually what we're seeing primarily is kind of like, I would say there's like maybe a bit of tension right here, and then kind of a little bit of a tension with this volume right here is forming an invisible line that's creating tension there. And so that's cool. The cool thing about tangents is that we don't want to necessarily avoid them. We just want to avoid them where we don't want the eye looking. And if I just unfocus my eyes and look at this as a whole, my eye goes here and here and kind of nowhere else in the image. And all this down here just kind of feels like, I don't want to say wasted space, but if the goal of the image is to highlight the ship, then we're not doing ourselves many favors by adding tension in places that don't need it. Like the tension here, like that. And I think that's formed by kind of a tangent between these two spaces right here, and amongst other things. The other thing that I want to point out is that when you cut something off with the border of the image, it has a tendency to feel like not necessarily this so much as this. It feels like in some ways that shape could go on forever. And so as a result, it kind of unbalances the image slightly. And I think a good way to undermine that, like let's say we wanted to keep it so that the planet's not as important, is to just scale it up a little bit. And kind of make sure that that cutoff is past like a 70-30, like before you had it like this and we were cutting off maybe 20% of the planet, and now we're cutting off closer to maybe like 40% of the planet. And that makes it feel kind of a little bit more purposeful. And then from there, we can, once we have that in place, we can also mess around with using the tangent of the planet to draw the eye in various directions. And it's easy as just kind of moving things around. The other thing you can do, again, continuing to lie to tell the truth, is play with the position of the shadow of the planet so that we have a little bit more value coming through on key places like this. The other thing that I've done in this, which is worth noting, is that because the background, or the midground, I guess, is here, and then there's a whole space there, there's kind of a natural, just dialogue between the two spaces that's moving along this angle right here. And so because we're, instead of paying attention to that, we're kind of creating a line with the ship like this. In a way, we're creating another kind of compositional tangent right here. So what I might do is kind of play into that dialogue a little bit more, or avoid it entirely. Like I want to put the IDA frigate's head there so that there's a little bit more contrast between the two, but I don't know if that's what it wants either. Because from a pure shape perspective, I'm squinting. If we wanted to keep it horizontal, then what I'd say is it would be something closer to that, where we are going back to our rule of thirds. We're keeping the subject dead center in the middle. But the other thing I want to do is make sure that the offset that I've added into there is balanced, right? Because if this is the front of the ship, right, and we kind of always want to, as humans, we always tend to look towards the head, or especially the eyes of anything. So this is kind of the main subject of the ship, and this is a supporting subject. But because this is way out here, because it needs to be, right? If we set up our composition like this with our focal point right there, then by virtue of the ship's design, unless we rotate the ship in space to kind of match something a little bit more like this in perspective, then this is going to hang back over here. But that's where the planet comes into play, where because the planet's balanced really hard onto the right side of the image, then the imbalance that's created here is kind of, or the other element of the ship is kind of balanced out. And this is what you might call a steelyard compositional element, which is to say, if you have a crane, right, and it's like this, there's a weight here, and then that holds up a lighter weight over there. And depending on how the difference of how big the difference of the weights are, the distance between the two can change. And so I would argue that in a way we have a bit of a steelyard composition working together, where if we imagine again a crane, let me see if I can work this in a way that makes sense. If we imagine a crane, here's our volume 1, here's our volume 2. I can see a crane in perspective holding this volume and holding that one, with the tower being like through there. If that makes any sort of sense. It could not. Finally, one of the more challenging ones is this battle scene. And I think that there's a lot of really strong elements to this, namely that you can't help but pay attention to this. And then the secondary and tertiary elements exist to kind of contextualize the image. But what's happening, and you've done a really good job of making sure that this ship is centered and is the focal point. But what I think has happened is that because we as the viewer are looking down on the ship, it feels less intimidating and less powerful than it could be. Furthermore, we've cut the image pretty much evenly in half. And generally speaking, 50-50 relationships don't look as visually interesting as you want them to. If you look at landscape photography, that feels really dynamic. Usually the horizon's up here or it's down here. And each one has its own things. When the horizon line's up here and here's the sky, you're focused on what's happening on the ground. Conversely, if the horizon line is down low, we're focused on what's happening in the sky. So because we have this nebula in the background that is effectively creating a horizon line, we're looking at this and focused only on that, and in a sense the secondary elements there just kind of don't really matter. And it feels, in my opinion, a little bit unbalanced. Now, this is just personal preference, but I think what would be nice is to push things a little bit outside of what I've been saying before. So what I've been saying before is the rule of thirds. Generally speaking, you want to put your interest points in the center. But I think it could be really interesting to push this upward to like here. And then take our secondary elements, or at least one of them. Where are you? take our secondary element and put it down here subordinate to counter it. And I might even offset the main one slightly so that we form a little bit of tension with the corner there. And then we can give ourselves a little bit of a mini steelyard inside of here. And then this, you know, if this is the subject, let's make it the subject. Really, you know, let's really pump it up a bit. And what I'm doing when I'm putting it up here is making sure that the points of contrast again are, you know, the lightest points are naturally against the darkest points, that the contrast is maximized. And then the secondary parts, which already exist in pretty good spots, are not nearly as high contrast. And then I might add, you know, another thing up here and down there to give us a leading line in, so that the eye can come up, move around, come through it, and leave the image. One thing that's also important is that if you look at an image, try to pay attention to where your eye naturally goes, and see if it gets stuck. Because moving back to one of the older ones, what I was noticing was my eye kept getting stuck like here and there and kind of going back and forth and had nowhere to go. So one of the sort of ideas that I had, well, not I had, but one of the things that's nice is, well, if I'm just looking at this and paying attention to where my eye goes, it goes here to there, down to here, and then kind of either follows this path on the way out, or comes back around and follows it out, and it doesn't get trapped in the image. And then finally, with this one's a little bit crowded. Actually, the more I look at it now, the more it feels kind of too much so to me. Heck, I might just messing around here. I don't know, some wacky thoughts here. I think the fact that it's blurry is not really giving me any any points here, but that feels a little bit nicer. I'm just thinking about where my eye's headed here, and I go here, I come up to here, then I go down to there, then down to here. I kind of sweep back off the image, and then maybe come back through again, and then back out. I feel like that's a little bit better. Anyway, I hope this long, rambling, 17-minute long video was helpful. If you disagree vehemently, by all means disagree, man. Cheers, dude. Looks good.